Hi, folks. How are you, Kieran?
Good. How are you?
Good. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well.
Thank you for joining us this evening.
It's my pleasure.
Yes. Hey there, Amanda. Haven't connected with you in a while. That's kind of nice to see you on the screen. Hello,
Hi.
Dilip.
Whoops, I've got my company background here. Let me change that up.
Okay.
Hi, Deborah. Good evening.
Hey. Hello, Melissa. Hey there, Ron. Here we go. Why don't we give this just a few minutes? We can start at 7:05. I'll be back in 30 seconds.
Sounds good.
All right.
Hey, Deborah, this is Dilip here. Quick question before we start. For the previous session, I had missed the first one that you had. Since you record these, is there a way to get access to the Zoom recording?
Absolutely. So what we did was put, and this is going to show up in our newsletter that's going out next week, the recording link of the previous
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
in the newsletter, but it's also to share with you on our website. You know, there's a resources section on the Two Trees Initiative projects, last one being the Trees and Trash Action Campaign. At the bottom of the page, I can also share the recording in the chat as we get started here, just to cut to the chase, but we do save these on our website in the resources section on the subject matter web page, and we're starting to send them out in our newsletter if you missed it. But I will do that for you now.
Okay,
so
perfect.
who else just joined? We have Corey. Hey there, Corey.
Hi there.
Hi there. You are coming in just on time. We're going to get started here. So again, you know, on my short list of favorite people is Kieran Hunt, who I enjoy very much. Don't get enough of him. He has been an advisor on SJC's Trees Initiative when we were back doing tree mapping during the pandemic. He kicked off with us. And he's an extraordinarily talented and credentialed guy. I'm going to let him tell you what he is doing these days for Asplund, but he is affiliated with all those, important tree organizations, not only in the state, but internationally. So he knows a lot, but he has a very practical sense, and he was a good first base coach on lots of matters, just conferring with him about what we should be teaching the public about stuff. This is obviously of keen interest. Believe it or not, pruning young trees, unless you get specific permission from the forester in Jersey City, is illegal. However, when you adopt a tree, you are sort of encouraged to take care of the tree, watering it, mulching the tree pit, also pruning it. But there are no instructions that really come with that, and you're not really supposed to do that. But we'll learn a little bit tonight about how best to care for either the trees and, in front of your home, on the street, if you adopted a tree, if they're on your property, if you're part of a park group who is undertaking some of this with supervision, that kind of thing. So Kieran can give, some scenarios where you'll be able to contribute to what needs to be done, right? And you want to do that knowledgeably. So here we go. I'm going to give you access to the screen, Kieran, which you now have.
Thank you. Start sharing here. There we go. All right. Well, thanks, Deb. That's a very kind introduction you made for me. Again, my name is Kieran Hunt, and I'm here to talk about developmental pruning of young trees. So Dr. Ed Gilman and Tracy Parton over at the University of Florida were very kind in developing a slide deck about this topic that's publicly available, and basically the best slide deck around for this kind of work. So rather than trying to recreate the wheel here, this is basically the only presentation I give where I use somebody else's slides. So I'm going to be giving you Dr. Ed Gilman's talk because, frankly, I couldn't do it better than him. He's one of the foremost researchers at University of Florida and in the United States on tree pruning. The guy really knows his stuff. I actually think he might be speaking in New Jersey at this year's Garden State Tree Conference in Atlantic City in March. So if you're attending that conference, I highly recommend attending his talk. I'm pretty sure he's going to be there. So a little bit about myself. I am, well, actually, this is an old slide. There we go. I am the digital engagement lead with Asplund's digital innovation team. I basically help translate the needs of vegetation management, field personnel, and customers into digital solutions for work management. So applications, business intelligence, dashboards, and other reporting. So I just sort of help liaise between a software department and field personnel who are out there actually doing tree work to make sure we're building apps that help support the work that they're doing and make them smarter about how we manage trees here at Asplund. As far as my credentials are concerned, I'm an ISA certified arborist. I'm an ISA certified utility specialist. I'm also a licensed tree expert in the state of New Jersey. And part of what I'm engaged with right now in tree care industry, I'm a member of the executive board for the New Jersey Forestry Association. And I'm the chair of the Arborist Exchange Program for the Society of Municipal Arborists, as well as the chair for the Utility Arborist Association's Environmental Stewardship Committee. So I'm about to step down from the NJ Forestry Association board. My term is up and I no longer live in the state, so I'm going to step back from that role. But you'll still find me at these other international organizations. I'm pretty actively involved in them. And in my free time, I like to climb, whether it's trees or rocks. I like to get up into the sky. I'm a pretty short guy, so I like to get up into tall things. So let's talk about pruning. We're going to talk a little bit about sort of this slide gives us sort of an overview of the main takeaways of this talk. Since I am speaking with folks who are not professional arborists, I'm not expecting you to be pruning 50-foot tall trees from a bucket truck or climbing up into trees with a chainsaw and taking out 6-inch diameter limbs that weigh 300 pounds. I'm expecting you to be doing if you do any pruning at all of trees, I'm expecting most of it to be happening while your feet are on the ground and you have a pair of hand pruners or loppers, or maybe you have a pole clip, something that you can do from the ground. There is a lot of really important pruning work that you can do to help establish good structure and a strong leader in a tree while it's young, while you're just standing on the ground. So in the tree's first 5 to 10 years, you can accomplish a whole bunch of really important developmental structural pruning on a young tree to help it establish good structure and form, to make it more resistant to storms, to make it a better asset in the landscape that hopefully will live longer, that will be able to reap more benefits from, because it'll have fewer conflicts with the surrounding environment, and it'll have overall better structure, which can lead to better overall resistance to storms and better health. So what we do when we're pruning young trees, or any tree, before we do anything, is we just set our objectives. What are we trying to accomplish? We need to determine what our pruning cycle and dose are. These are related. We'll get into these in a little while. And then we'll execute our pruning plan. So we want to try to make good cuts. We want to prioritize the trees that have structural issues to make sure that we are addressing those issues before we let them get too out of control and to a point where we no longer can actually correct them. We sort of have a time limit with trees as far as correcting a lot of structural problems. If we don't address them when they're young or when they're relatively small, eventually they'll get big enough that we can no longer address them without doing permanent damage to the tree. And then we also have this concept of temporary versus permanent branch management, something else that we'll get into as we proceed through the talk. In general, what we are looking for in a tree, in the landscape, what we would consider to be good form, is a strong, dominant central leader or trunk, strong branch unions with good branch angle attachments, and a balanced canopy. So we don't want it to be too far to one side or another. We want it to have some sort of symmetry around the trunk. So one of our objectives is reducing structural issues that, if left unaddressed, could eventually cause failure in the tree. So the 3 ones that we're mainly going to talk about today are codominant stems. These are more than one stem of equal or similar size, originating from the same point in the tree, that are usually competing for dominance, either in the overall canopy or in a section of the canopy. We also want to address included bark. This is where a branch attachment is narrow enough that bark becomes pinched between the branch and the parent stem. This can become a very weak union, which, if left unchecked, can eventually cause a failure during a storm or a snow event. And then we also want to address unbalanced canopies. Trees will tend to grow towards the light, and if the tree is getting more light on one side than the other, it'll tend to grow towards that side and can become fairly unbalanced. Or if the tree is growing in competition with another tree on one side of it, it may become unbalanced. It's pretty natural for trees to develop this way, and given the proper space and enough nutrients and other good conditions like good soil, the tree can build up really good structure against that lean or whatever it might be doing to find the sun in competition with other trees. So trees can somewhat make up for being unbalanced simply by putting up extra what we call reaction wood or buttress wood that can help support it against a lean. But the better solution to trees in that situation is to try to prune them so that they don't become unbalanced in the first place, provided they have the space to grow up straight. So this is what a strong branch connection looks like. We've got the main stem on the left, or what we call a parent stem. So this parent stem has what we'd call a child branch coming off of it. That child branch has a well-defined branch collar that helps envelop the base of that branch where it meets the parent stem. And you see we have a nice U-shaped branch attachment. So let me use my little laser pointer feature here. U-shaped branch attachments are what we're looking for. We like to see this. V-shaped branch attachments are the ones that we want to look out for and try to prune away. A U-shaped branch attachment has ample space for the bark to grow in between the parent and the child branch. But if we look at V-shaped branch attachments, these allow bark to become included in the crotch where the two branches meet. This included bark is a structural problem. Every year, every stem on this plant is going to put on a ring. So trees grow wider in cross section every year. They put on a new growth ring. So some people have the misconception that trees push up out of the ground. That's not true. Trees grow out from the ends of their shoots. They put new growth out from the ends of the shoots. So any plant material you see sitting at this height is always going to be at that height. It's just going to get thicker over time. So all of these branches are going to get thicker against each other, causing this wishbone action to push against each other. That pressure is a structural weakness. Some trees are better at compensating for this type of attachment than others. Elm trees are a good example of trees that can really do well with included bark and codominant leads. They tend to just form super strong attachments at those spots. They do a good job of buttressing those attachments and creating extra supporting wood to help compensate for those weak attachment points. And some trees like elm are actually capable of making these some of the strongest parts of the tree. But in general, most of the trees that we plant and manage in the landscape, we want to avoid this type of branch attachment, especially when they're young and this is low to the ground. We want to try to manage these away. We want to try to manage these so that they are temporary or so that we can get rid of them in one shot, so that as the tree grows larger, these don't become massive problems that are no longer solvable when the tree becomes mature. So this is an example of a codominant stem with included bark that broke during a storm. So this is during a hurricane, and the size of this wound in the tree is such that the tree is probably compromised structurally in the long term, and it may be a good candidate for removal at this point, unfortunately. Similarly, here's a tree that broke out in a 70-mile-per-hour wind during a hurricane. So you obviously can't manage for all storm events. Storms come, they're going to kind of cause damage to trees, but where possible, we try to manage for these structural defects, especially when they're small and easy to manage for, so that later on they don't grow into a larger problem that can cause the whole tree to fail. A bad practice that we'd like to avoid here is called lion's tailing. This is where you prune too much of the inner foliage from a tree and only leave foliage towards the ends of the branches. This has a number of problematic results for the tree. In the short term, lion's tailing a tree will cause it to be more resistant to wind and storms. And in the short term, I really mean very short term, like less than a year. Because there's such a reduced amount of foliage, the tree has less of a sail in the wind, and so it's not going to be it's going to be less likely to fall over. But this does all sorts of problematic things to the tree's overall structure. It causes more growth to push out from the tips, so the tree will become taller and wider in cross section, while still lacking any foliage in those lower parts of the branches. The lacking foliage in those lower parts of the branches is going to reduce the amount of taper or the amount of diameter growth that those lower parts of the branches, those scaffold limbs, are going to have. So as the tree grows taller, it's not going to get as proportionately thicker in those scaffold limbs holding those lion's tails up as it would if you'd left some foliage on those branches. So keeping the foliage going all the way down the limb is important to maintain proper taper on those branches. So as those limbs get longer over time, they're going to have relatively thin scaffold limbs holding them up with this big sail that's overextended outside the tree, causing a strong lever arm against those inner scaffold limbs that are bare of any foliage. As the wind blows against those scaffold limbs, it becomes much more likely that those will fail because the taper is reduced, because they've become overextended, and because you've changed the overall lever arm on the plant itself. So not only can this cause branches to fail in the long term at the scaffold limb, it can also cause the entire tree to fail because you've effectively changed the center point for where the wind's lever arm or where that moment occurs on the tree. If you look at these trees when they had a full canopy of foliage, the lever arm on the tree was somewhere around here, was where the focus of that pressure would be when the wind's blowing against the tree. Now that we've moved that sail up higher in the canopy, even though the sail is technically maybe smaller because the canopy has been shortened to be all the way towards the tips, you're still going to end up with a lever moment that starts up here, causing a much stronger lever arm on the whole tree, and that can cause the tree to uproot and fail. So lion's tailing is explicitly written to be a bad practice in ISA best management practices materials. It's a known bad practice. It's something that should be avoided. It also reduces our ability to do what we call restoration pruning on trees. So after a storm, a tree has branches that break out. We do restoration pruning by cutting away the broken spots and trying to prune back to an area where the tree can have potentially heal, or at least have less chance of decay and better overall aesthetics and structure. But if you take out all of these lower limbs on these scaffold leads, what you're going to end up with is anytime that one of these branches break out, you're not going to have any options for a branch to prune back to. You're going to have to prune that all the way back to the parent limb or the main stem, because you've removed all of those lower lateral branches that you might have had as options to prune back to during restoration pruning. A number of reasons why not to lion's tail trees. So aside from that, when we're planning out the overall structure of a tree, we need to think about what our permanent branches are and what our temporary branches are. So in a place like this, where we have a parking lot and where we want to have basically access around the tree, we need to make sure that we focus our pruning to establish a tall lowest limb height. So if we want to have cars moving under it and parking under the tree, we probably want to have a lower limb height of somewhere around 16 feet, similar to what roads have, so that even a box truck or a larger truck can get under the tree. If we only need smaller cars, we might go more like 12 feet, or if it's just over a sidewalk, 10 to 12 feet is probably good enough. But we need to think about that when the tree is young, because if we let these lower limbs get too big, eventually it's not going to be possible for us to remove them, and they're still going to be in the way. So we're going to end up with a tree that's sort of in conflict with its environment now. At this point, if we were to remove this large limb here, we would absolutely expose the heartwood to the air and introduce significant decay into the tree, and the tree might never recover from that pruning wound. This is an example of that. A large pruning wound caused significant decay, and this is in an already decay-prone species. I'm assuming this is yellowwood. I don't actually know the species, but it sure looks like a yellowwood, and they tend to decay like this. You open up that heartwood. So just for context, trees grow, like we said, from the outer rings out. But all of those rings are basically straws conducting water up from the roots and then sugar back down to the roots and to the other parts of the wood from the leaves. Most of that vascular tissue that's alive in the cambium is in the outer rings of the tree. So if a tree, in this case, if we use this example, this yellowwood's live tissue that's actually capable of conducting water and nutrients is only in this outer ring. All of this wood on the inside is old tissue that has since been plugged up with lignin and is now dead. This is essentially dead wood on the inside of the tree. That's what we call heartwood. That heartwood gets plugged up as a defense against fungi and other pathogens, but it is not very resistant to decay. If you expose this to air, decay organisms are going to get into it very rapidly, and you're going to see that decay move through the tree. How quickly it moves through the tree and how well the tree can respond to that decay is very much a matter of how healthy the tree is and what species it is, how old it is. Some trees can hold up really well against decay. Some of them, like this yellowwood, cannot. So we want to avoid exposing heartwood wherever possible, even though some trees might be able to seal up a larger wound that exposes the hardwood, it'll take them years to do that. And during those years, decay organisms are going to be feasting on that hardwood and causing decay on the inside of the tree. So we want to avoid allowing ourselves to get to the point where we'd need to make a hardwood cut. And we do that through structural pruning from an earlier age. And by pruning on a cycle, whether it's every 3 years, every 5 years, we try to prune regularly enough that we're avoiding ever allowing ourselves to get to the point where we would have a cut that exposes that hardwood. Again, those large, low, big cuts can all be avoided with early pruning. We need to plan ahead. Where's our lowest permanent limb? What type of access or space do we need around the tree? Is there a road we need to prune over? Is there a sidewalk? Is there a house? What kind of clearance do we need? If you leave a large lower branch on the tree thinking that it's going to not be in conflict, you have to also consider that some branches, as they get thicker and heavier, will start to droop over time. So what if you have a branch that's forming an angle over a house and it's going to make it, but just barely, you probably need to take that limb off, because at some point it's going to get so heavy that it'll now be leaning against the house or a fence or a playground set or whatever it is that's around that tree that you don't want it to be in conflict with. We have to think about the long term, because these trees very likely are going to outlive us. So we have to think about, where's this tree going to be in the environment in 50 years? What do I want it to look like then? And it's probably going to be very different from what it looks like today. So we want to prune to promote strong structure. We can do this from the very beginning. Once that young tree is established in the landscape, once you've planted it and given it a couple of years to establish and get its root structure back in shape, we can start pruning that tree for structure. So these are the 5 main points that we want to focus on for developing good structure in the landscape. We want to develop and maintain a dominant leader. We want to identify that lowest branch in the permanent canopy, which on a newly planted tree might not even exist yet. We want to prevent branches below that permanent canopy from getting too large. So we don't want to allow those temporary branches to get so big that when we finally remove them, it exposes the hardwood. Or at least we want to do it in such a way that it only exposes a very little bit of hardwood and can seal up very quickly. We want to space our main branches along the dominant trunk. It's not good to have multiple branch attachments in one spot, because when those branches get very large, they can cause a structural problem for the main stem. We want to keep all of our branches less than a half the trunk diameter. So we don't want any branches to get so dominant that they become their own trunk in their own right. We want to make sure that if we're maintaining a strong central leader, if this is the type of tree, the species of tree that can have a strong central leader, we want to make sure that we keep all branches off of that lead less than half that diameter of that trunk. And finally, we want to work on suppressing growth on branches with included bark and any other branches with defects that we don't want to just remove outright. We want to suppress growth on those by performing reduction cuts. And we'll see what that looks like in some of the subsequent slides here. So we're back to this slide. We want to set our objectives. We want to determine our pruning dose and cycle. And we want to execute our pruning plan based upon our objectives, our cycle length, and our dose. While we are pruning, we want to focus on making good cuts. We don't want to cut into our branch collars. We want to make sure we leave those collars intact so that they can seal up those wounds. Trees do not heal, so to speak, they seal. So when a tree has a wound in it, it can't regrow the tissue to close it up like we do. What a tree does is it grows new tissue from that branch collar to seal up that wound so that no air can get in, because decay fungi need air to survive. So as soon as that tree's heartwood or cambium is exposed to the air, it's susceptible to decay pathogens, decay organisms, different types of fungi. Once it seals that up, it's no longer exposed to air. Even if there are some decay fungi inside of the wood now that are behind that seal, they can no longer survive because they can't get any oxygen. Or if they are in there and they're managing to survive, they're getting very reduced oxygen that the tree can easily keep up with whatever decay might be occurring inside there. So we want to make our good cuts. We want to prioritize our structural issues, make sure we account for those first. And we want to work on making sure we understand where our permanent branches are, and maintain all of those other branches as temporary branches, assuming that eventually they will be removed. So our cycle length is how much time there is between each pruning event. Generally in New Jersey, 5 years is a good rule of thumb as like the most frequent pruning cycle that most municipalities or other large tree managers would use. You can absolutely go shorter than that. The shorter the cycle length, the better, because you can do a lot more and you can be a lot more precise and gentle with your management if you're pruning on a very shortened cycle. But obviously, pruning every 2 or 3 years is very expensive if you're paying somebody to go out and do this pruning work. Or even if you're just doing it yourself, it costs you a lot of time. So generally speaking, in New Jersey, where we're a pretty temperate climate, we don't have a huge growing season, but we have a decent sized one. I'd say, you know, around 5 years or a little less is a really good, very easy to manage pruning cycle. A lot of people will go longer than that simply for budget constraints, but 5 years is a good rule of thumb. So every 5 years, you're going to have a higher pruning dose than if you were pruning much more frequently. So you just have to manage for that. As you're out there setting your objectives and considering your cycle length, you have to consider your dose based upon how soon it is that you're going to come back to that tree. If you know you're going to come back to the tree in 2 years, you don't have to do as much. If you think it's going to be at least 5 before you come back, you probably want to take off more now. You want to do more now so you can make sure you prevent any major permanent problems from establishing themselves. So our pruning dose, again, is directly related or inversely related to our cycle length. The longer our cycle length is, the more we're going to have to prune at each pruning event. So another thing to consider is the age of the tree. When a tree is very mature or over mature, we really don't want to take much off of it, maybe less than 10% for an over mature tree. Generally speaking, they recommend not to prune very mature, over mature trees at all, unless there's some good reason to, if there are diseased limbs, dead wood, that sort of thing. We try not to prune any live foliage off of old trees if we can help it. But other things to consider when we're talking about younger trees is things like how decay prone are they? How long is our growing season? And sort of how quickly do they respond to pruning? Are they in a very good health? Healthy, vigorous trees tend to be much more capable of sealing up wounds much faster than stifled or not very vigorous, unthrifty trees. So generally speaking, especially when we're talking in the municipal sense, in the larger urban forest landscape, we're going to have a larger pruning dose with a larger overall cycle length. We're going to be pruning every 5 to 10 years, maybe. We're going to be taking more off at each pruning event because we know we're not going to be back for 5 to 10 years. And so that's going to affect how large the cuts are, whether or not we're going to be reducing or just removing certain branches, how big the voids are in the canopy, and how good the trees look immediately after pruning. We always should expect that the tree might look a little weird after we prune it, especially a young tree. So we have to accept that if we want to work on establishing good structure. We just have to state that up front. When you're pruning trees for structure, especially young trees, you might make them look a little stupid in the beginning. That's okay. The tree's probably 90% temporary branches anyway. We're just trying to make sure we establish that main central lead, get rid of any problems or structural defects that might be happening, and then help to push growth up so that tree continues to establish that good, strong, dominant central leader. So here's an example of that. On the right-hand side, so in the left picture, but on the right-hand side where the red arrow is, we see this codominant stem. That is a stem that is competing with the main central leader that we want to maintain. So in here, the arborist took off about 75% of that competing limb. So they didn't remove it. They did a reduction cut. They made it shorter. And what that's going to do in the tree, it's going to tell the tree, okay, I only have one dominant leader now. And believe it or not, trees actually have some peripheral awareness of these things based upon where their buds are and the types of growth that happens in the tree. Trees have hormone balances within them that help them to control different branches from growing too quickly. It helps them to send signals to different parts of the tree saying, you should grow faster, you should grow slower. We're only in the veg management industry. We're still, I would say, working to understand precisely how all of this stuff works. But trees have growth hormones like auxin and gibberellin that dictate how different tissues within the plant respond. So if you were to take off that codominant limb and reduce a couple other lateral branches around the tree, that's going to encourage the tree to put more vigorous growth into those end shoots that were not removed. It's going to help to establish a better, stronger, more dominant central leader. So this is all the foliage that was removed. That's 75% of that one codominant lead was taken off. That's what it looks like on the ground. Here's a tree that a number of arborists are assessing, making their plan for how they're going to execute their pruning. This tree's got pretty good symmetry, right? Overall, it's got a nice circular canopy. It's got a pretty good central dominant leader in the tree, but they want to thin it out, help to make sure that that tree isn't super storm prone for damage, and they want to make sure that they're establishing their strong central leader still, since this tree is still fairly young. So what they decided to do here is remove about 25% of the foliage from throughout the tree. If you notice, following the pruning, the main trunk is clearly visible. That's what the arrow is pointing to. And this is a good example of structural pruning. Trees pruned like this are going to be less prone to storm damage than lion's-tailed trees or trees that are not been pruned at all. So because it allows a little bit of wind to pass through it, but still leaves foliage throughout the tree is not going to have any sort of different lever moment, right? It's got the same sort of center point on where it is as a sail in the wind, but it's going to allow more wind to pass through it. Because of that, the wind is going to be a little bit less prone to being thrown over in a large wind event like a hurricane. And we also see that we've got a nice central leader here. It's going off a little bit to the left here. That's okay. We'll see what this tree does as it continues to grow. But this tree's got great structure right now. This is a good example of sort of medium-aged tree structural pruning. Maximum critical diameter is basically the largest cut you're willing to make on a tree. This is going to depend on the species. It's going to depend on its age. Is it more decay prone? And it's also dictated by the pruning cycle. If you know you're going to be back in 2 years, you can afford to only make small cuts. But if you know you're not going to be back in 5 to 10 years, you have to be willing to make some larger cuts to accomplish your goals and address any structural defects that you might encounter. So that means that you might even be willing to expose a little bit of heartwood if it's a young, vigorous tree, because you know it's going to seal it up, and it's better than leaving it for 10 years from now when you come back and it is now a permanent problem. So branch size, we're not just talking about its overall size, what our sort of maximum pruning diameter is. We're also talking about its proportion relative to the size of the trunk. So if the branch is less than half the trunk diameter, you can expect that you're probably going to have fairly few consequences of removing that branch entirely back to that parent stem. If it's 1/3 to 1/2 the diameter of the trunk, you're getting close to being problematic, especially if some heartwood is exposed. You might have some trunk defects, but it might be worth considering just shortening it, performing a reduction cut on that branch rather than removing it. If you reduce that branch and you come back in 5 years, you may find that the trunk has grown much more relative to that child stem, and you may now be able to take that off without making quite as big of a relative cut, right? Because if you've let that trunk grow faster than that little branch that you've reduced, you've now made it much less than half the trunk diameter. If it's more than half the trunk diameter, it's likely that you're going to have defects. And if it's large enough to have heartwood, you're likely to have defects. Again, this is going to depend largely on the health and vigor of the tree, how old it is, and what species it is. If it's a species that is extremely decay resistant, then you can go ahead and expose heartwood all over the place. If it's vigorous, if it can take it, if you're not taking too much overall live foliage from the tree, you've got a little bit more leeway. But if you've got a decay-prone species, you might want to be more careful and consider coming back more frequently if you have to make larger cuts to accomplish your goals. So here, what we're really talking about is preventative pruning, trying to make sure that we are not allowing any major structural defects to form on the tree in the first place. Any structural defects that we see, we spot them early when they're still relatively, basically not a problem at all. You can just see them as a future problem, and we address them now, either by removing that problem entirely or by reducing the branch that it's on, thereby making it grow more slowly and sort of managing it as a temporary branch so that later on we'll remove it, maybe once it becomes even more dwarfed relative to the main trunk that it's growing off of. So I've been talking about reduction cuts. This is the difference between a reduction cut and a removal cut. A reduction cut reduces the overall length of a branch, but very importantly, it brings it back to a smaller limb. So you can't just make a cut up here. It's got to be down somewhere near another child limb, and it's got to be another small limb that's maybe at least a third the diameter of the parent branch here. So we can't just cut this back to a little 1 millimeter tiny little twig. That's not going to cut it. That twig cannot support all of this wood that's going back to the stem. You got to think about branches as being their own little mini trees. Trees are like fractals. Trees have all little trees kind of growing in them. Basically, every tree's part needs to be somewhat self-sufficient. For the most part, a tree will not support a branch that can't support itself. So if a branch isn't producing enough sugar to support all the woody tissue that it's got, that branch will eventually die and the tree will shed it naturally. This also happens when a tree shades out its lower branches. Eventually, those branches aren't producing enough sugar to keep themselves alive. The tree's not going to push sugar into those branches to keep them alive. They are now a liability. The tree is going to let them die, and it's going to drop them off. And trees have naturally adapted these branch collars to seal up where those branches used to be once they've fallen off the stem. So this is all us just trying to mimic the natural processes that trees sort of have in their own in nature when they're responding to different stimuli. So when we reduce a branch, we want to cut back to a lateral branch that's capable of supporting the remaining tissue here. So it needs to be at least a third the diameter of the parent branch we're taking off. That is a reduction cut. A removal cut takes back the branch to its parent stem. So in this tree here, we removed this whole branch back to the main stem. On this one, we reduced this branch back to this child stem here. That's the difference. Another good rule of thumb when making pruning cuts is to avoid bark tear down. So if you cut a branch from the top without making any sort of undercut beforehand, there's a good chance that at some point, the branch is going to start tearing down once you get far enough through that stem. Maybe about 2/3 of the way through, you're going to find that that branch will just tear off and the bark will start to tear down the branch. So what ends up happening here is where this branch is connected here, it's just going to tear down and you're going to end up with a peel out and a whole big wound below where the branch was attached. They call that a tear out. You don't want to have that sort of wound on the tree because the tree does not do a good job of sealing that wound back up. What we would like to do is do an undercut, maybe around 12 inches from the trunk, and you do about a third of the way up from the underside of the branch. Your second cut is a top cut, and it's going to go all the way through. So you're going to remove this piece of the branch. When you do that, and that gravity starts to pull it down, it's only going to tear out to this first undercut you made. This is going to prevent you from having bark tear out that goes back down to the main parent branch. Once you've done that, you can now do your final cut, where you cut just outside of the branch collar. And now there's not enough weight to cause any sort of tear out or wounds there. So you'll be able to just cut this off with one final cut from the top down. That's how you make a proper cut of any size. Obviously, if it's a small, tiny little limb and you're cutting and you've got both your hands and you're on the ground, you can just hold the branch with one hand and cut it with the other. You don't have to worry about bark tear out, no problem. But if you've got a larger branch that you can't just hold, or if you've got both hands on the saw, you've got to be more careful than that. You've got to do an undercut. This is another example of a branch collar here. So we want to make sure when we are pruning this branch, if we're performing a removal cut on this branch, we want to make sure that we're cutting just outside of that branch collar. We do not want to cut into it, but we don't want to leave much branch outside of it either. So the sweet spot is just outside of that branch collar. Any cuts into this branch collar are going to slow or entirely prevent that tree from being able to seal up that wound. So we really need to make sure we leave that branch collar. It is very special tissue. Not only does it help to seal up the wound, but it actually helps to slow down decay organisms from entering the trunk in the first place. We want to make sure that we leave that important tissue on the stem. Here's an example of what it looks like when you cut into that branch collar. Here, this tree is not able to seal up this wound. It's got a little bit of growth coming out, but it does not form that nice donut that we want to see after we've left that branch collar intact. This is what we call a flush cut, and this is absolutely the wrong way to prune a tree. Do not perform flush cuts when you're doing removal cuts on a tree. The tree won't be able to seal it up. It'll expose your heartwood. Everybody's sad. When you're performing a reduction cut, you're not going to have a branch collar. Branch collars only exist on a child stem that's coming off of a parent stem. And you can expect that the smaller the branch is relative to the parent stem, the more likely it is that you're going to have a branch collar. If the branches are pretty close in size, but this one's just a little bit smaller than that one, you might not have a branch collar. At some point, the way that these vascular tissues intersect, if this child branch becomes so dominant that it's close to the parent stem's diameter, it will lose that branch collar and become its own stem in its own right. And so you end up with sort of losing the ability to remove it without exposing heartwood. This is one of the reasons why we reduce branches and try to sort of make them smaller or subordinate them relative to the parent stem, because we're trying to make sure we establish minimum decay, minimum pruning cuts, but we also want to make sure that where possible, we establish a branch collar so that we can remove it back to that special tissue so it'll seal up well. So here, when we're performing a reduction cut, we need to bisect the angle between where this branch bark collar is, a branch bark ridge is, which I should have pointed that out on one of these previous slides. This is what we call the branch bark ridge. In a U-shaped branch attachment, we will often find that the bark from the parent and child stems will meet here, and it'll sort of fold back up in the middle. It'll form a nice ridge in between where the parent branch and the child branch meet. That's the branch bark ridge. Here's a really young one. It's not poking up or anything, but you can see a pretty solid line here. Not every species of tree forms this nice line. So sometimes we have to imagine that branch bark ridge when we're performing these reduction cuts. But in general, when we're performing a reduction cut, we want to look at the angle of the branch bark ridge, which is often fairly parallel to the child branch here. You see how it kind of runs parallel there. We want to look at that angle. Then we want to look at an angle that's imaginary, that's basically perpendicular to the parent stem that we're reducing. Okay, so this is 90 degrees from the direction of growth of this parent stem. We want to bisect these two angles, and this is where we want to make our reduction cut. The reason for this is twofold. We want to reduce the amount of overall surface area that's exposed to air. So the smallest area of the circle that we can make would be this cut, right? We're making a perfect circle there. The farther down we go on this angle, the more oblique that circle becomes. It becomes more of an oval, and so it gets taller in one direction. So we're actually exposing a bit more surface area to the elements here when we make it at this bisected angle. If we were to come down here, we would have a much longer circle, even more exposed to the air. So we want to reduce the amount of exposed wood to the air, but we also want to create an angle that helps to shed rain, so water's not pooling on there either. So we don't want it to just be facing straight up where water can just sit on it. We want water to run off, which is going to help minimize decay by allowing it to dry out more quickly. So that's why we're picking this angle. This is somewhat arbitrary, very open to debate in the arboricultural community, but this is a good rule of thumb. So if we're moving about the city and we're pruning young trees, the city forester magically has given us permission, or we're somewhere else and we've got a bunch of trees we're pruning. We want to prioritize which trees to prune based upon which ones have defects that need to be addressed and which ones have come from the nursery with poorer form. We want to make sure that where we can leave ones until next year, we leave them, and we only focus on the ones that really need to be addressed now when we're working on managing an urban forest. Part of what we're doing, again, is making sure we understand where that lowest permanent limb is, and then manage all of our other branches as temporary branches, assuming that eventually they will be removed. So we're doing things like subordinating them, reducing them to help push growth into the main leader, to help push growth into those permanent lower limbs, so that we understand that eventually those are going to be removed because they've been subordinated. They haven't been allowed to grow too thick. So hopefully when we do finally perform those removal cuts on those lower limbs, we're not exposing heartwood. They're less than half the diameter of their parent stem. It's all planning to make that final cut that's not going to cause problems for the tree or have unnecessary large wounds or major decay. So we don't really want to worry too much about things like palm trees, which obviously we don't have in New Jersey. Remember, this is from the University of Florida, but we sure do have crepe myrtles in New Jersey and other small shrubby type plants that grow naturally with multi-stemmed architecture. Those sorts of plants, we probably don't need to do a whole lot of structural pruning on. But trees that we expect to grow into large shade trees, our maples, our oaks, our hickories, our London plane trees, these are the ones that we want to make sure we manage for good, strong central leaders, good branch structure, manage for any sort of structural defects that might be occurring, especially low in the canopy, where they could form a really bad permanent problem if left unchecked. These are the ones that we really want to make sure we understand how we're going to prune them to have good structure into the future. And you should consider that every new tree that's planted is probably going to have almost no or basically no permanent branches on them. So for instance, these are all young, relatively new trees planted along a sidewalk. Probably all or basically all of these branches on these trees are temporary. The lowest permanent branch, if we're going to prune it to 16 feet over the tree, might be somewhere up here, right? So we got to consider that when we're managing these trees, and we have to be willing to make a little bit of sacrifice, and especially if we're on a 5 to 10 year pruning cycle, we got to be willing to make some sacrifices and make them look a little funny in the, to the end goal of making sure that they have good permanent branch structure. That's what we're looking for here. So the main part of the rest of these slides is going to be talking about pruning plans based upon different times at which we're visiting these trees. Most of what you all might be engaged in is going to be in this first 5 years. But I do think it's important for you to see the full cycle up to 30 years, because what you're doing today has an impact on what people are going to be doing 10, 20, 30 years down the road. And it gives you a good idea of what you're looking for as an end goal. So if you're allowed to come in here and perform this initial pruning at years 5 and maybe even 10, you're giving yourselves a good head start for when you hire a tree company to come out and do those larger tree prunings. They're going to have a good head start. They're not going to have a whole lot of defects that have been left unchecked that they're going to have to now, basically make larger pruning cuts to get rid of, leave these big holes with heartwood exposed. You've eliminated a lot of those problems because you came in the earlier years of the tree's health and you helped address and eliminate a lot of those problems. So we're thinking about branches as temporary versus permanent. We don't want to remove more than 35% of the live foliage as a rule of thumb. So basically about a third of the live foliage. You got to kind of eyeball this, right? This is generally a hard thing for humans to gauge when looking at a tree's canopy. But it's just a rule of thumb, not a hard and fast thing. I don't want people to get stuck on that number. People get stuck on numbers pretty easily, but just a general rule of thumb, no more than a third of the live foliage. Younger trees can tend to handle more removal. So you can take 25 or so, about more than a quarter of the live foliage off a young tree if it's well established. If you've given it a couple of years to establish before pruning it, it's probably going to be okay. We want to reduce all branches that are greater than 1/2 the trunk diameter. Again, these are basically all temporary branches, right? So if some of them are more than half the diameter of their parent branch, the trunk, the main stem, we got to start reducing those to subordinate them, because eventually we're going to remove those branches entirely. Those lower branches are temporary, and we don't want them to continue to be more than half the diameter of the parent branch, because then we're going to have a bad cut when we remove them. So today, we're reducing those branches to subordinate them, slow their growth, and hopefully that parent branch will grow faster than those branches we've subordinated. And later on, when we come back in another 5 years, they'll be less than half the diameter of that parent trunk. We want to reduce and or remove all branches or stems that are competing with your one selected leader. So you've selected a main lead, all the other branches around it, we want to, even if it's just giving a little trim off the tip, back to a lateral branch, just to reduce it a little bit to help take that terminal bud off and tell that branch you're subordinate. That's enough to help push growth into the main central leader. We want to reduce or remove all large, low, vigorous branches. So if it's a low branch that's growing really fast to the sides, those eventually can become real problems. If we allow them to get too thick, especially in relation to the main parent stem, they could potentially become a relatively permanent problem that when we finally get to remove it, might be a large pruning wound. If we allow those things to get big and low, they can really get out of control pretty quickly. And then obviously we want to remove all broken, cracked, or severely damaged branches. Just as a rule of thumb, as an aside here, I know I've sort of mentioned it, but I want to say this directly. When you've planted a new street tree, you should not be pruning it at planting. A new street tree, especially if it's a balled and burlapped tree, has just had about 80% of its root system removed. So removing any more live matter from the tree anywhere is problematic because the tree is already extremely stressed. Leave it alone. The only things that I would consider to be exceptions to that rule are this bottom line here: broken, cracked, or severely damaged branches, or something that's got insect problems on it, scale, that sort of thing. Anything that's damaged or cracked or infested beyond repair, you can get rid of that. It's not doing any good for the tree. Everything else, you leave. You're not going to worry about structure when you're planting a brand new balled and burlap tree. Now, if y'all are starting to bring in like air pot plants that have good root structure right from the start, you might be able to get away with doing a little bit of pruning right up front because those trees have not had any of their roots pruned. But you got to think about the transplant shock and how well you're going to be watering them. It's still a good idea to give it at least a year to establish. And on a balled and burlap tree, something like a 3-inch diameter or 3-inch caliper, 4-inch caliper tree, you can expect that tree to be in transplant shock for about 2 or 3 years. So you might want to wait 2 or 3 years before you do any of this initial pruning. So your initial pruning on a balled and burlap street tree might be at year 3 to 5. Okay, that's what we're looking at here. Most branches are temporary. That's where all these rules are going to apply to. So here is an example. We are going to be pruning back all of these low, aggressive limbs. We're trying to push growth into this main central leader here. We want to keep our child branches off of the main stem less than half the trunk diameter, right? So we're going to shorten a lot of these branches that are around half the trunk diameter to make sure that they are subordinated so that later on when we remove them, they are firmly less than half that trunk's diameter. So here's a good example of what that looked like before and after. Looks pretty dumb, doesn't it? I don't like the look of that little tree, but this is a good example of good structural pruning on this tree to try to establish a good central leader while subordinating and reducing all of those lateral branches because they are all temporary branches. Every one of those branches on that tree, except the main stem and maybe one of these lateral branches, maybe. They might all be temporary too, but everything else is for sure temporary branches on this tree. So even though it looks kind of dumb today, this is really good for the tree's health and overall structure. We are absolutely teaching this tree how to grow straight as a street tree. So the sort of 3-step process here for training a central leader: identifying which one is going to be the leader, which can be very difficult at times. Sometimes you just got to pick one, and that's okay. It's not always obvious. Identifying which stems are competing with that leader, and then deciding where to shorten or remove those competing stems. So here's an example from that tree we were just looking at. They identified that this stem was competing with that main central lead, and they decided to remove that entirely back down to this parent stem here. That's going to slow down this large lateral stem right here greatly. So this stem here went from having all this live foliage to only having this little bit of live foliage. So it's going to be putting on diameter growth much more slowly now than this parent stem, which still has all of this live foliage on it. Now, if you've got some pole pruners, you might even go up and clip back a couple of these other ones just to help subordinate them to that main central lead that we're trying to establish here. But this was a really important step in making sure that we maintain the diameter of this child branch as less than half this parent stem, because this is a temporary branch. We're eventually going to remove this. All right, that's step one. We've whacked it back a little bit. We've taken less than 35% of the tree off to try to establish that main central leader. Then we have this sort of middle ground at years 5 to around 20. At this point, we're not going to want to remove more than 25 to 35% of the live foliage. This is going to be dependent somewhat on the health and vigor of the tree, the species of the tree, and what is needed on the tree. Like, we don't have to take a whole bunch off if it's not necessary, right? If the tree is growing with great structure and there's nothing we can identify in the tree that needs pruning, we can leave it alone. But chances are we're at this point in the game, we've still got plenty of temporary lower branches that we want to keep subordinating. Some of those at this point we might be removing. We're going to make sure that we are reducing or removing branches with included bark. We want to reduce or remove any competing leaders, other branches that are competing for dominance of the overall canopy of the tree. If there are more than 3 competing leaders, we can do this in stages by reducing and then eventually later removing them. And also here we're starting to look at permanent branch structure, right? So we've got a tree that's between 5 and 20 years past planting. We're also looking at, there's plenty of height now, so we've got plenty of potential for permanent branches in the canopy. So now we want to start spacing those branches apart. So we don't want any permanent branches to be growing within 1.5 feet of each other, because we don't want those attachments so close to the trunk that they can cause a structural problem for the main stem. Again, like I mentioned earlier, having large scaffold limbs growing within 18 inches, less than 18 inches from each other can be problematic for the overall structure of the tree and can potentially compromise the structure of the main stem. So here's another good example of a before and after. The arborist is in this tree. They identified that this is a competing branch. This reduction cut is going to slow the growth of this child branch here and allow the leader to go faster. This also probably is still a temporary branch on the tree. I guess it really depends on what sort of overall height they're looking for here. This is probably in a research plot somewhere, so who knows what the sort of like the theoretical potential lower branch height would be on this tree. But if we assume this is a street tree, it might be 16 feet, in which case, yeah, this is still a temporary branch. So we're trying to keep this subordinated to make sure it doesn't get above half the diameter of that parent stem. And here again, we're trying to push growth up into that main central leader here. So this is, remember this tree, right? We prune this at, say, 5 or 10 years post-planting. 2 years after that, we've got this before picture, and then here's after. So here's what he's done now. He's gone into this lateral branch, and he's subordinated this, which is, again, you see how vigorous this branch is growing? It's growing just as vigorously as this main central leader here. Even though it's not growing straight up, this branch is absolutely trying to achieve dominance in the canopy. These 2 branches are co-dominant right now. So we want to reduce this and maintain our main central leader here. So that's what the arborist has done here. All the rest of these look great. They're all pretty subordinated. Not much has to be done inside the tree, but he did this to make sure that this branch doesn't try to become a new co-dominant lead in the tree. So that's after 2 pruning visits. We can see the structure of the dominant stem here. It's got a good, strong central leader. This tree's got good overall structure, even though, again, with this permanent versus temporary branch structure, the tree's got a bit of a lopsided look to it. It looks a little scraggly. That's okay. Eventually, this tree is going to become a mature shade tree with excellent structure. Here's another good example here. You see all of these competing leaders coming out of the main center part of the tree. We're trying to establish this as our central lead. So what we've gone through, we've reduced all of these competing branches off the stem and left that central lead intact. If it were me, I'd probably have reduced these side limbs a little bit more as well. I might have had a reason for leaving those on there, but overall, this is what we're looking for, a nice, strong central lead with obviously no competition up in the center of the canopy. This is that same tree 2 years later. Again, they performed additional pruning on it. Similar look to what it looked like the last time. So that was the 5 to 10 year mark. Now we're looking at the later stages here, the 20 to 30 year mark. This is where we're starting to establish that final scaffold limb architecture. So we're going to, at this point, achieve our sort of lowest branch height. So we're probably going to remove all of those lower temporary branches that we've been subordinating and reducing and keeping sort of below the main stem diameter. We're going to remove all of those. We're also going to do a little bit more to make sure we reduce any competition with the main leader. This is probably the last time we're going to do that, because as the tree achieves more mature scaffold limb architecture, it'll start to round out in a lot of species, and it's okay at that point for it to start sort of losing a central leader. It depends on the species here, but a lot of species at some point you can sort of ignore the central leader. It's gotten tall enough that the tree is just going to form an overall rounded canopy, and that's okay. We want to make sure our scaffold limbs are spaced apart from each other, 18 to 36 inches away, so we don't have those clustered branches. We're trying to remove any of those branches below that first permanent limb, trying to make sure we address any other structural issues like competing leaders and included bark. And this is the kind of stuff that we're looking at now. So here we've got our before picture. We've reduced some of these competing leaders. We've helped to reduce even this larger competing lead that's coming off of the main stem here. But notice that we're not reducing it nearly as aggressively. This is a permanent scaffold limb here. We want this to be healthy and vigorous. We want it to be well balanced. So we want to make sure it's still got good foliage left on it so that it sort of matches what's on the other side here. We're still maintaining a good dominant leader here, but we're allowing these scaffold limbs to have a little bit more control over their parts of the canopy now. We've also eliminated any lower temporary branches. This tree has achieved its final lowest branch height. So it is now at the height we want it to be above the parking lot, so it's not going to be conflicting with any box trucks or anybody trying to park under it. This tree is ready to just grow up into a mature, healthy, well-structured shade tree. Here's my favorite graphic of this slideshow. This is a really good example of the steps we go through to achieve that overall canopy architecture that we're looking for in the tree. And just some of the ideas that we just talked about in that sort of first 5 to 10 years range, and then the like 5 to 20 year range, and then the 20 to 30 year range in that larger tree. So here, all of our branches are temporary. Nothing on this tree is actually the permanent branch except for its main stem. But all we're doing right now is trying to establish a dominant leader and remove any structural problems or reduce them. Here, we're going through, we've started to establish some permanent canopy. We're still highly focused on establishing and maintaining a good central leader. We're reducing or removing any competing leads that might be going up and competing with our central lead. We're reducing all of our temporary branches to make sure that they don't get too much diameter growth, because we are going to eventually remove them. And we're subordinating anything else in the permanent canopy that might be competing with our main central leader. And of course, we're addressing any structural problems we find, included bark, codominant stems. Once we get to this larger tree, we are now simply removing anything that's competing with our main central leader, with the understanding that after this point, we may not be so worried about that central leader. The tree can sort of round out and become an overall good scaffold limb architecture. And to that end, we're also allowing some of our wider limbs to have nice long growth. These are permanent limbs now. We want to make sure that we are removing anything that's growing, reducing or removing any scaffold limbs that are growing too close to each other. So for instance, this one here, we might just want to remove because it's growing so close to this lead here. This is another one we might want to just take off here. Depends on how soon we're coming back, if we're coming back at all. And again, addressing any structural problems, included bark, competing leads. So to go through that overall pruning strategies here, we're developing and maintaining a dominant leader. We're identifying our lowest branch in our permanent canopy. We're preventing any branches from below that permanent canopy from growing too large. We're spacing those branches along the dominant trunk so that we don't have clustered branches too close together. We're keeping all of our branches less than half the trunk diameter, and we're suppressing growth on branches with included bark. Now that number 5 is less important as we get into that more mature stage where we have some scaffold limbs. It may be okay to have them be around half the trunk diameter, depends on the tree species. And again, this is something that a professional arborist would worry about at that point when you're in that mature 30 years post-planting tree stage. But just as a good rule of thumb, especially when we're dealing with temporary branches, you always want to make sure that those are less than half the trunk diameter. So, and I just want to focus back on that first 5 years. So you can consider this to be pruning post-transplant. So once the transplant has established itself in the landscape, maybe 2 to 3 years after you've planted it there, if it's got good watering, if it's getting good shoot growth at the ends, the tree looks healthy and vigorous, we do our first pruning there. Then we might come back 5 years later and do another pruning from the ground. Might require us to have a pole pruner with us. We probably can still do everything from the ground. So we've got year, say, 3 post-planting and year 8 post-planting. Where you're allowed, shade tree volunteers can do both of those pruning events, provided you've got enough volunteers and enough equipment and somewhere to put all the debris that you're going to create. So if you're doing that, expect that most of your branches are going to be temporary. You don't want to remove more than 35%, more than 1/3 of your live foliage at a single pruning visit. You reduce all of those branches that are greater than 1/2 the trunk diameter. Reduce and or remove all branches or stems that are competing with your central leader. Same thing with large, low, vigorous branches. And you're going to take away any broken, cracked, or severely damaged branches, along with any that are infested with any insects or diseases. And that's it. Trees can be trained to grow without conflict with the built environment. We've just got to pay attention to detail, follow these simple steps, follow our ANSI and ISA approved best management practices to create beautiful and structurally sound trees. So let me get back to the meeting
nice.
because I can't see any of the chat right now. Where is my chat?
So, bravo. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes. And I just threw something up in the chat in case people were slipping away. There was a question that was asked about adopting a
There
tree
we
in
go.
Jersey City. So I was answering that question. Does anybody have a question for Kieran? Want him to go back to a particular slide or review something? This is a small group, so there's an opportunity here to spend a little time if you'd like.
I got
oh.
one question in the chat. Ron asked if we want a shorter decorative flowering tree like a dogwood, can we top them and allow multiple leaders so it's more full to maximize flowering like a bush? Would it be less wind prone if kept shorter? So it's a bit more complicated than just topping it. It depends on the species. Your example of a dogwood, I wouldn't top it. You can perform reduction cuts in such a way that you're encouraging more growth along the lateral branches. And you can do some internodal cuts, what you'd call a topping cut, where you're not cutting back to another child branch. You cut back, do an internodal cut, but you want to be sparing with those because even on a dogwood, when you perform an internodal cut, you'll often get a flush of new growth all along that node that you cut back to. And if you leave all of those new shoots growing all in that one little spot clustered together, you will eventually have a bunch of them that are very susceptible to breaking due to wind and snow. So if you do that, you're going to have to come back in a year or two, and you're going to have to clean up all of those flushes of growth to select only the branches that you actually want to establish there. So you got to be very careful about that. It's totally doable. You can pollard trees too. Like if you've got an apple tree or something else that's a cherry tree, something small that you want to maintain at a certain height, you can maintain it with a pollarding system where you come back every year and cut back to the same knuckles of growth. You basically just keep cutting back to the same branches. You start it young, you do it over and over again every single year, never miss a year, and you can maintain the tree at the same height. Every year it'll burst out with millions of branches, tons of flowers, When you prune it will depend on when it flowers, so you got to look it up based on your species. But if you do it right, you can maintain a tree at the same height for a lifetime and always have a new flush of growth with plenty of flowers. But you gotta, it's a system. So just gotta kind of look up what your system is, how the species reacts to it, and decide your system that way.
Okay.
Sorry, I actually couldn't see who was speaking before I started talking. So
Oh, it was me. It was Melissa. Hi.
There you
So
go.
I had a couple questions. The first one is like, would you prune like trees with indeterminate growth, like elms, more, like to train them? Like,
I would do similar pruning to this until we got that lower limb, that first permanent lower limb. I would keep pruning to make sure we maintain strong central leader, because at a young age, an elm can easily form codominant stems. And if you're near a road or a sidewalk, when that elm gets mature, that attachment point, even though it'll probably be really strong and like totally solid, it'll be
Right.
huge and it can take up a lot of space.
right.
So, but you're right. Once you get above a certain point, you've got a lot more leeway with an elm or even a London plane tree. They also do really well with codominance.
Okay. How do you, so you didn't mention the season for pruning, but I'm assuming we're talking like winter, like late winter, early spring for most species of trees.
Yep, it's a good rule of thumb.
So like when you showed the picture of the decay of the tree, is there like a filler you could put in there, or they don't have anything like that?
There's no filler. The only thing that exists is bark painting or wound paint. You can buy like a paint that you put on wounds.
But I think that's not recommended though for most. Or
It's,
most, they said studies it slows it down, like the healing or whatever. Only if
Yeah.
there's a species that's like going to be infected by a specific type of insect or something, you would use it. But
correct. It's contraindicated unless you're in a place like where you've got what is it? Oak
oak
wilt.
wilt, yeah.
Because if you're pruning while the beetles are flying, you've got a good chance of introducing oak wilt into the tree. So some people do use like they do paint their wounds if they're pruning during the growing season. Some people do it. There's not a whole lot of evidence that it's really that bad either, but there's not much, there's really a lot of good evidence that it doesn't do any good really either. So it's kind of just, some people do it, most people don't. I don't recommend it. I would say just prune in the winter and you don't need to paint any cuts.
And then I have one more question. It really doesn't have anything to do with pruning per se, but like, so in our town, we have a lot of trees that develop these frost cracks. Because they do have these codominant stems. I mean, is there any way to prevent that other than pruning early?
Yeah, well, I'm interested in what you mean by frost cracks, because usually those are not associated with codominant stems. Those are just
So
associated
you'll
with
have,
rapid
like,
cooling.
You'll have like V-shaped stems, large ones, and then you'll have these cracks that start to really develop. You'll have water that gets in there, it freezes, and then melts, and the crack gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Gotcha.
I know there are certain species of maples that develop cracks naturally. I'm not really sure how to tell the difference between those cracks and frost cracks, but I don't know.
So there are no trees that I'm aware of that develop cracks like as like a normal part of their growth. Maple trees, any tree that has a crack at an attachment point, that is a severe, it's a real crack, like where you can see it moving in the wind. That's a serious structural issue and
Right.
probably requires removal. You can prevent those from forming in the first place by cabling the tree, guying the tree. It's expensive, requires the arborist to come back at a regular interval to assess the cabling system. Eventually
Right.
it'll have to be replaced. It is an option, but it's really only good for like large specimen trees, very special trees that you want to maintain. Frost cracking, which is something that happens during rapid cooling events and can happen anywhere in the trunk. It's just a solid crack that just forms in the center of a stem.
Mhm.
The tree can often form reaction wood around those. Unless it's a really significant crack, it usually can just buttress that wood and eventually kind of seal it up in a way that it's not really an issue. The
Okay.
only way to prevent that sort of thing is to try to keep that foliage on the tree as much as you can. So it'll happen on that main stem that's exposed to the sun and the wind, but where you can keep that foliage, not lion's tailing, not allowing a lot of bare stem to be exposed, you can help to reduce the amount of frost cracking that you get.
Okay.
And some of those are actually started by sun scald. So like if you've got maples, a lot of maples growing in town, especially Norway maples, even some sugar maples, I think I've seen some sun scald on. Basically, if the bark gets exposed to the sun, the tree, that bark can die back, just gets sunburned and eventually dies off.
Oh, so it just peels off? Is that what happens to it? Like,
it'll usually form like a sunken spot, and then the bark will flake off, and you'll see like, a canoe shaped, basically dead spot where the bark's no longer alive. There's no longer any live cambium on that section of the stem. And it can be a big 10-foot tall spot, or it could just be a little patch. A lot of times, if a tree has storm damage and a big part of the canopy falls out, especially if something like a Norway maple that tends to form a lot of dense shade,
right.
all of a sudden it has sun just like beaming in on one spot of the canopy. And if you look at the scaffold limbs, you'll find some of them have this canoe-shaped branch that's got no bark on the top of it because the sun's hitting it. That's a structural problem.
Yeah. So are those spots also prone to rot, or they are?
Yeah, that's a decay. That's a spot that's open to decay. Because angiosperms, normal flowering trees, most of our street trees, other than pines and other conifers, most angiosperms form reaction wood to like to lift against gravity on the backside. So if you kill off the backside, it's no longer as capable of holding it up against gravity. And as that limb gets heavier over time, it's going to be more susceptible to failure.
Okay, I think that was all my questions.
That's
Thank
great.
you.
That's really great. Does anyone, before I jump in here and throw Kieran a curveball, does anybody have any other questions based on his presentation?
Yeah, hi, this is Dilip here. I have a question. Can you just go back to that slide on the lion's tailing? I didn't quite understand that in terms of just maybe a quick explanation again of what it is and if it's good or bad. I couldn't figure that out.
It's bad. I can tell you that much. It's right in the beginning, so almost there. We've got a couple of examples as well. So here was the first example here. So lion's tailing, basically, this is the after effects, or what it looks like post pruning. So what they did was they took off all of the live foliage on the lower parts of these scaffold limbs. So this had green foliage in here, and they pruned it away. And so what that did is it changed the overall sail of the tree. So the tree now, as it catches wind, is going to have that force of the wind centered up here. Whereas before, when the tree would catch wind, the force of that wind would be centered somewhere right in the center of the overall canopy. It's pretty hard to describe without an animation, but you can think of a single branch as catching wind throughout the limb. And so it sort of has an even distribution of force. And the way that trees respond to wind, they are built, they're naturally designed to flex a certain amount and shake a certain amount. Their leaves also deform in certain ways. So trees have all of these natural adaptations to become more aerodynamic in the wind, especially once the wind gets above a certain speed, like 25 miles an hour. A lot of things change in a tree, how it stands, the shape of the leaves. And so if you reduce the amount of live foliage on a branch, you have compromised its natural ability to shed wind in the way that it's designed to. And what you're going to end up with in the short term, you're going to have a smaller sail. It's going to catch less wind. It's got a whole lot more wind is just going to pass through the tree. So in the short term, this tree is probably going to be less prone to failure during a wind event. But in the long term, all of these branches are going to keep growing out from the shoots. And so what you've done is moved the center point of where the wind catches, where the tree catches wind from here up to here. And as that gets taller, that center point is going to keep getting higher. So on a larger tree with full canopy, you can expect that center point still going to be centered along your scaffold limbs, right? It's going to be in the center of the overall canopy as it naturally forms. But if you remove that lower canopy, all of your force is directed higher in the tree. What that does is a couple of things. Removing those lower limbs, all the green foliage that grows on these branches here, will reduce the amount of diameter growth that happens on those parts of the branches. So these leaves are feeding these branches here and causing them to grow more in diameter. These are going to grow more slowly in diameter because they don't have direct sugar access because their branches have been removed here. So the diameter growth on these parts of the stem is going to be slower. What that's going to do is it's going to cause the way that the tree tapers to, it's basically not going to taper in the way that it naturally would. So these lower parts of the scaffold limbs are going to remain thinner than they should be. And so the branch naturally wants to bend like a fishing pole, where it bends more at those supple, thin twigs up top. And as you go farther down the branches, they get thicker and thicker, they taper out. And so it bends less and less. You end up with that fishing pole action as the wind blows against it. Here, we're losing that taper because we've removed all those sugar sources from the wood down here. And so once you start to have that fishing pole action up here and all your force is centered up high, these are highly susceptible to failure because they don't have good taper anymore in the long term as they grow. In addition, because you've allowed the center of the sail to be higher overall in the tree and reduce the overall taper in the tree, you've potentially made this tree more susceptible to wind throw. So this is a good example of a tree that over time would be more susceptible to wind throw because its canopy is way high off the ground and it doesn't have any of this lower canopy to help absorb some of that wind. And I know that overall, the larger canopy you'd think as a larger sail would cause higher wind throw, but because of the way that the tree is designed to become more aerodynamic in wind, it actually becomes more susceptible to wind throw, even though the overall canopy, that sail, is actually smaller. And this has been proven in a lot of studies where they blow trees down with big fans. Does that explain it? I know it's like,
No, that's awesome. That explains it. I think I missed that part when you said, because as you said, the branches are providing the sugar for the growth on the lower limbs, and so it's going to cause it to be top heavy and fall off. That's what I was trying to kind of connect it to there. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, honestly, that question is its own hour-long talk.
Thanks.
Is that everyone with questions? Can I throw you my curveball?
Sure.
I'm going to screen share here.
Oh, let me turn mine off.
Okay. And we have, go here. All right. So we have up here. Yeah. So these days, things are changing, and we have a combination of just trying to get a handle on, how best to manage process and, the sustainability office taking up a lot on their shoulders. They're reorganizing. They are partnering with the new division of forestry here. We had a reorg in the spring where the DPW, Parks and Forestry divisions were split up. Parks went to a new Department of Recreation. The Forestry division remained with Department of Public Works. The new infrastructure department has responsibilities for all things green infrastructure, and under the new sustainability office, which had been vacated for over a year, there is an approach to coordinating a lot of urban forestry activity, and they may even hire their own forester to look at things like enforcement and reporting and grant writing, different kind of role than what we had been recruiting for. And this new, gentleman, Forester Mike, who comes out of New York City, we're very encouraged because there's just a higher standard there and more knowledge resident. So we're off to a really good start. And one of the things that had been, needing to be managed better, people's wishes to adopt a tree, right? So in a very basic way, this new form hit the scene, which really was great because we have a resident response unit here, or call center, where, everything that, goes on that you have a question about or concern about can be called into the city. And though, trees and urban forestry were always held sort of separate because it's a big one. And we want to have reporting specific to this. So this new form is a little bit more encompassing. You're requesting a tree, you're reporting an issue, you're asking a question. So some of this is laid out as a survey in some respects. Some of it is just a direct request form for a tree. So if you go to the form, something new that's appearing on the scene, and SJC has had meetings with American forests who had developed what would be called the tree equity score, that is now appearing as an optional field on this application, suggesting to residents, could you, add your neighborhood tree equity score if you want to. That's kind of how it is. And this is related to a street tree, a school tree, a park tree, et cetera, et cetera. We're looking at, because we are crazy mapping people, right? When we looked at this tree equity score, first of all, we're not clear, and we're going to have some conversation with the sustainability office about it, but what the purpose of asking a resident to fill this in would be, directing them to a map in their, experience in navigating this. They land on, their neighborhood, which has a tree equity score of 90, right? This is right in the, on the spine of an environmental justice corridor in Jersey City, which does not have a lot of trees. So what shows up here, though, is that in trying to understand some of this, our interpretation of the methodology that, American Trees and this tree equity score program, and I'll be happy to share information in the chat, some links that people could, kind of peruse on their own, including you, Kieran, but at a block, census block group level, taking in factors of what the capacity for the neighborhood might be, looking at what the current canopy cover is here, and then indicating, what a good goal would be. So if they're at 12% now, the suggestion versus, maybe some, a neighborhood association saying, hey, we need a lot more trees here. We have very few. Can't we just go after this like banshees? And the city trying to sort of suggest that based on a variety of factors, the capacity, the ceiling that we might want to hit would be 20%. So let's shoot a goal for 20% versus 50% in your neighborhood. But again, this tree equity score of 90 is kind of indicating to people, which is why we're going to, look under the hood a little bit, that you're scoring pretty high right? So not for anything, there's not a lot of deficiency here, but it is confusing to people how to square, what would be indicating here, surface temperature on average, so a little UHI and some of these other demographic characteristics into an index, call it a vulnerability index, right? Because we've come to know that, some of these characteristics have it be that there's a relationship to public health factors in a neighborhood where trees play a part, right? So they're including some of these perspectives. And then also sort of narrating a story here that, well, you have this much cover, but you don't really have the capacity to have as many trees as you may want. So this is sort of rattled people a bit. I'm not sure that this is the best thing to bring their attention to, but on, some level, I could appreciate the city trying to educate residents about, what we can and cannot do. What is realistic for your neighborhood? There's a general outcry in Jersey City to plant more trees, right? And stop taking some trees down and whatnot. We had experimented most recently, and you may or may not be familiar with this thing called participatory budgeting, which is, alive and well in New York City. I don't think there's another
Just a heads
municipality.
up, I'm gonna have to jump soon. I can't stay too much later.
Okay. So all the wards in Jersey City want more trees. So everybody voted for more trees and to spend their budgeted amount on trees. And then this was published. I'm wondering if you're familiar with it, if you have any perspectives on a tree equity score program.
Yeah, I was afraid you'd ask me that. I honestly am not very familiar with it. I know people at American Forests. So I could put you in touch with somebody who works for the the nonprofit that built this.
I would like that because we
I'm
met
certain
with
that the
someone a
people
long
I
time
know.
ago. But I don't remember.
I'm confident I don't know anybody who's been involved with this project, but maybe somebody at American Forest can connect you with somebody who is, who was a part of it. But I bet if you went on their website and found like the basis for this, it would probably say something. It would probably have some sort of disclaimer like, this is a nationwide tool, and on the granular scale, it's probably a lot less accurate. Like this is probably, like most nationwide tools, is probably built as a sort of like general snapshot rule of thumb thing, but I don't know how much you can trust any one of these things in a given area. Like you say, you have to take a really good look under the hood, and I just don't know when it comes to
No,
this.
that would be great because they're doing this by neighborhood and then they have an entire municipal report. Like, so they do it for the city. And
Yeah,
they
it's awesome.
yeah. So again,
I'm assuming that it's because it's equity. I'm assuming that it basically takes into account the city and then puts you in the context of the city, which would
yes.
mean that if the city's low canopy and you're low canopy, your score is going to be good because you're not any worse off than the rest of the city,
Right.
So that's why, I mean, it said 12% and your score is 90. Like this has got to be separate from like a canopy score.
Yeah, so that would be great. Like to talk to someone over there, Kieran. Thank you for that introduction.
And
you can just text me, or if you want to put it in the chat.
And the other thing, well, I'll email you because I gotta dig it up. But
Okay.
I know I've got a contact. But the other thing I'll leave you with is to look into the 330-300 rule, which is a new sort of rule of thumb that's doesn't
The
necessarily
3300 rule.
330-300. Yeah, it was put together by Cecil. I'm not even gonna try to say his last name. He's got a wonderful, very like Swedish sounding last name. I forget what country he's from, but I cannot pronounce his last name. But the guy put together this 330-300 rule, which is basically saying that everybody should be able to see at least 3 trees from their windows. They should have 30% canopy cover in their neighborhood, and they should be within 300 meters of a park.
Yeah. Yeah,
And it's just a rule of thumb. There's no research behind it. It's just put together by a guy who's very well respected in the urban and community forestry field. He's a researcher. He's got a lot of notches on his belts, and he just put this together, just threw it out there one day, and it has developed a lot of traction. So
what's the name? Gentleman's name.
Oh, so it's Cecil. Here, I'll tell you in 1 second. Pull up.
It's literally 330/300.
Yeah. And actually, I can probably just find a link for you. Give me 1 second.
Thank you.
It's brilliant. It's so easy to remember. So it makes it's gonna catch on.
Well, that's why he did it, right? He's like, you know what? I've been doing this long enough. Like, I know these are all good rules of thumb, but like, you know, you come up with all these things for cities and you never get them through because nobody can swallow them. He put this together. He just published it on LinkedIn 2 years ago, almost exactly. And it has really like caught fire. Right here, I'm going to put it in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
This is just a little article about it. I think it links back to his original LinkedIn post when he just threw it out to the world, and it has really developed a lot of traction. And so he's running with it. It can be modified, obviously, because it was just thrown into the air. But I think it's a great starting place for speaking with decision makers because it is so easy, so simple.
Terrific. Well, thank you for that. When you get around to it, I know you got a job. I'll take that American Forest contact too.
Yeah, I got you. Yeah, I'd say that Cecil's 330/300 rule is at least as important for discussion with your policymakers as this American Forest thing, because probably most of your residents would fail that 330/300 rule. I mean, they all would fail the 30, right? Pretty much, but like, that's fine. A lot of cities in New Jersey don't have 30% canopy. That's fine. You could adjust that. But the 3 and 300, I mean, everybody really should have access to park spaces, especially if you're living in a city. That's like critical.
Yeah.
And in America, we do a terrible job with that. So
Well, Jersey City is claiming that everybody in Jersey City can walk not even 10 minutes and be in a park.
that's awesome.
So-
If it's true, that's great.
Correct.
So something to think about. But yeah, I'm going to jump. Sorry that I can't stay later, but I'll email you the American Forest contact and let's, connect again sometime soon.
Okay. Last question. I'm just going to hold you for a second. Do you
Sure.
know anyone over at the Trust for Public Land?
Ooh, where are they located?
I don't know.
I haven't even heard of that, but if you want to like send me any leads you have on that, I might know somebody. I don't, but I probably know somebody who does.
Okay, good. Thank you. Good night to you
Thanks.
all. Good night, Karen.
Talk to you later. Thanks for having me.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Deborah, I just wanted to ask you something.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Just no,
Hey.
I had come across a study about it was done in January 5th, and they did like micro analysis of all the green stuff in New York, like the grasses and just small patios of plants, and they added up how much it was storing, and it surprisingly all those plants stored a lot of carbon. So I was going to send it to you if you want to. It was done by the Columbia Climate School. I just thought, for areas
Thank
where
you.
you can't plant trees, maybe, I'm sure grain gardens and all that stuff, but that people
because
still
we're
have
trying
access
to come at this
to
from different angles, Melissa. That would be great. And why don't you just join our group? You're becoming a groupie.
I know. I love the work you do. I wish we had the resources to do it in my town, but we're so small. But we're trying to get with other towns like Ridgewood and Fairlawn, kind of create a group, of towns, so we're a little bit bigger. We have more power, right, to negotiate, treating ash trees or whatever it is.
Well, what about the county level?
Oh, the county level? I don't know. I mean, there's 70 counties. I mean, 70 towns within Bergen County, right? 1.1 million residents.
Do you want a really inspiring story? Let's trade stories. So in the footprint of Chicago, let me just look at that. You send me something and let's communicate with each other over. Have you ever used Slack?
I have not. I have
All right,
not.
let me screen share here. So Slack is a messaging system,
Mm.
right? That all us crazy SJC people, are on each of these channels. So there's probably, let's see how many people are on here these days. So it's kind of, a learning community unto itself. And then I just want to see people on the general channel. That'll give me a number. What are we up to here? So people who've come in and, volunteered with us, or people that work on a
Right.
team or whatever. So that is 228 people. Not all these people are super active, but a lot are.
Okay.
And then they leave and then they come back and, all that. And these are all the various conversations if you see on the left. Like they're either team channels or
Right.
conversations, right? And what you get to do is, send a message to everybody. Like I was just going to say something to, everyone about what, Kieran just shared, the 330-300 rule, right? And though we can interact with each other personally.
Well, that's good.
I miss a lot of emails, so text is always best, and anything related to SJC, people know to reach me here, right? But I will, let's just start something here. I'm going to send you an email right now. Give me your email address.
It's MSAW. AW. V is in Victor. That's me. Right there.
Okay, great.
The cat.
All right, so I'm just going to do hello and 330-300 rule shared here. Right, so I'm not going to make this flowery. We're just starting a thread. So now you and I are connected.
Okay.
Right, so yes, if you send me that, then what I want to send you is in the Chicago area there, and this is one of the things that really inspired me. There is a tree initiative up there that's affiliated with the USFS and the people who are doing work up there moved to unite the municipality, which I think had 125 townships or whatever the hell that was. Let me just look at this. So if I call it the Chicago Tree Initiative. Yeah, great. It's called the Chicago Region Trees Initiative. I'm going to send this to you in our email thread that we just started now. And these people, not only are they fabulous, and along with Kieran, when we were first starting down this journey, I found them thinking that, well, what about Hudson County? There are 12 municipalities here. Why can't we, hook everybody up? Wouldn't that make sense? And, not for anything, got into a lot of information sharing and coaching and encouragement, and it was just great. So I want to share this with you, and that might give you some inspiration. Where is this? I just sent that to you. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to reply. I'm going to put all of my signature, yada, yada, in here. I'm just going to reply with this link. So what I'd like to do is put you into my address book. So let's do that too. Well, I don't have to do that on your time, but I will.
No, it's fine.
So you're in Bergen County, and I think is it Ridgewood or
Glenrock.
Glenrock?
Yes.
Okay.
So we're right next to Ridgewood, which is right next to Paramus. I'm sure you know where Paramus is. So that's
Yeah, I have
kind of the area.
relatives up that way in Rivervale.
Mhm. Yeah, it's
It's
kind of
up that way, right?
So and there's a lot
Okay.
of trees. There are a lot of trees, you know, and it's weird. Like Fairlawn, they don't really take care of their trees. And you have like Ridgewood and you know, takes care of their trees. And then so it's just very different, like perspectives. There's some towns near us that don't even have a shade tree committee, you know, they don't care. I mean, it's just like and there's some who are like super strict. They have like all these ordinances. You can't like do anything to a tree, right? So it's different degrees of.
Well, how did you get involved, and how did you get what I'm going to say?
I'm a crazy tree lady. So.
I was going to say you got bit by the bug.
So I moved to Glenrock 6 years ago from Edgewater with my husband. My daughter was 2. So we're like, oh, we need to move to the suburbs, the good schools, whatever. So we moved to Glenrock. Our house we moved to was like flipped or whatever. So they never did anything with the yard. They cut down all the trees. There was just bricks and dirt, you know. So I was like, oh, so I was like, I got some quotes, and then I was like, the landscaping is going to be too expensive, right? So I was like, I'll just do it myself. I'm a stay-at-home mom. I can do it myself, right? So I did. I got all the rocks out. I seeded all the grass. I started cutting beds in. I'm like, oh, I need trees. I don't know anything about trees, right? So then I started researching trees. I'm like, oh, there's all these really cool looking trees, like really cool looking trees. So then I started buying a tree here and buying a tree there. And then like I got into like collecting like weird trees, and like now I'm into like weird conifers because they can be small and I can fit more in.
So you must have an extraordinary property that you've nurtured.
No, it's only like 1/5 of an acre. It's small. I mean, up here, northern Jersey, like things are, we're all kind of tightly packed in, unless you live in like Upper Saddle River or something. But it's yeah. So I'm like, how can I fit as many trees into the small property as possible? So I found all these weird columnar trees, and I'm buying from specialty nurseries. And my poor husband, like, he is not into trees. I mean, he doesn't hate them, but he's like, you're kind of crazy. So he stopped buying me jewelry. Now he just buys me trees. I tell him which trees to buy. They're expensive. Right. Some of them are, like $400 tree that's this big. He's like, what?
Absolutely. How old are your kids?
What?
Do you have kids?
She's 9.
9. Okay. So I'm sure she has some appreciation for this.
I take pictures of her with the trees when I plant them, and then like every year, so you can see how she's growing with the tree. Yeah. So I'm a little
unbelievable. Melissa, give me your
they
phone
were looking
number.
For someone in the shade tree committee, because I guess someone had
yeah, and are you a committee or a commission?
We are a committee. We're not a commission.
Committee, yeah, we're a committee too.
Yeah, we want to be a commission, but I don't think they give us the power.
Well, yeah. Are you a what do you call it? There's a particular name for the type of township.
We're a borough. I mean, I don't know if that
right,
but so we went through. We have all the like certification, the NJUCF thing. We have all that.
Yeah.
Our community forestry plans due next year, because they're redoing the rules, so they're giving us an extra year, I guess, to comply.
Right. What is your phone number?
My phone number is 617.
Yeah.
767 3232.
617
767
767
3232. And our community is actually pretty progressive. It used to be more Republican, and then more people have moved here, and so it's become more, let's say, moderate to Democratic leaning. So all our council members are women except for one. They're all Democrats except for one. So most of our
So they
committee
probably
is all
have an
women.
appreciation for the environment. Do you have an environmental commission there?
Oh yeah, they're very active.
Okay, what is your area code again?
Oh, 617.
Okay,
Sorry,
so
message.
my phone number is in my signature in my email.
Okay, let's show that down.
So you got that there.
Email. Do you have a favorite tree? Just curious. I always ask
Well,
people that.
Yeah, I really like exotic trees, but I'm an oak girl. I
Most of
really
the people on my committee are oak people too. But so we worry about, have you guys had an oak wilt or anything like that in town?
no, not at this point.
Yeah, I know. We don't either, but we're like so worried because like half the town is red oaks. I mean, you have a lot of streets just lined with red oaks. And I'm like, if oak wilt comes, like most of these trees are gone, like just gone.
Yeah, I hope
It's-
not. We, got hit with the with the ash
Did you guys treat
borer. Pardon me?
Did you treat the ash trees?
Yeah, they did.
Good.
Yeah, they did. But they didn't have, it's interesting. Is your community involved? Do you have a lot of community stakeholders that are
No. See,
engaged?
that's the thing. I think they would, except it's just, yeah, we don't. We not really. I think if we put out the call, but it's a little hard because like we literally are like 5 people. And so it's, just the work we have is like almost, I have like a full-time, this is like a full-time job and I don't get paid. Like,
Yeah, no, I
the
got
work
it.
I
gotcha.
do. And so it's hard to get the community outreach portion done as effectively as I think it should be done, because we have like most of our town is 30% of the residents are under the age of 18. So it's a very family oriented,
Wow.
kids everywhere town.
Mhm.
So like anything that you can get kids into, parents like, right? So
Absolutely. Do you have enough trees, or are you needing to plant more, or what?
well, we need to plant more. We're
Okay.
cutting down. We cut down 300 this year, maybe more.
Wow. Why did you cut
Yeah.
that many down?
I don't know. We're trying to figure that out. Because it's more than we usually do. I think we have something like a 600 tree deficit over the last 10 years. So we've cut down more trees than
There's
we've
not development or disease or
disease development. I think lack of maintenance. I don't think there's like, we don't really have much of a maintenance program.
yeah, no
I mean,
one
we
does.
have a tree foreman who comes and trims, but it's not organized. It's not, okay, these are the trees for these 5 years. These are the trees, and none of that. They just go by and like, "Rah," and that's it.
Do you have a budget to hire anybody to, like, a Davy Trees to come in and do some assessment or whatever?
That's what we're, so we have our budget meeting in February. So that's one piece we're going to ask for money for that. I don't know if the town will give it to us. So we have to get an inventory. Obviously, we got a grant to get an inventory, but it's been held up because certain council members are just hard to work with. So, but hopefully we'll get that going.
So I'm going to put in the chat the Davy Trees. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. The Davy
Oh, no.
Trees recommendations, their management report after they did a partial inventory. And then in October, we signed a new contract, council approved, doing a full inventory of all street trees and park trees.
Oh.
So this is a 2021 report that they generated for us. And
You thought they did a good job.
yeah, they're excellent. I mean, they're renowned, right? And so they're doing the rest of our inventory, and, so maybe you want to just take a look at the type of thing that you could expect from them if you ever went that way.
Yeah, no, we
Right.
I mean, I really want an inventory, because it's like, how do you manage something you don't even know what you have?
Right.
I mean, it's like, so I think the last I think they did a partial, or they did an inventory like 15 years ago, or 15 or 12 years ago, before I had moved here. And I think at that time we had about 20,000 trees, but I think it's probably a lot less now.
Yeah.
Because right now you can, in your little property, most people have small properties, less than half acre, and you can clear cut your entire lot right now, and there's nothing the town can do. And some people do that. I mean, I know
Really?
people cut down trees so they can grow tomatoes, like, because they want the sun. It's like, really? Like, no. So yeah, we're working. That's the other thing we're working on, is an ordinance, so that if you cut down a tree, you have to either plant one, or you could pay for us to plant one in town, basically.
Right.
Most municipalities have that.
Sure. Yeah, we even have it. As much as we don't have a lot of things, we have some things in place. So so let's just say walkie-talkie.
Right.
The next, what we did this year with this webinar series is expanded to include a conversation about urban design, because there are capital improvement projects
Right.
that include business districts and, street trees and, neighborhoods that, while there's always an element of trees, are very badly managed, and then are also just not designed well. The proper team of people are not pulled together. So we have a couple of people are very knowledgeable, particularly using New York City.
Right.
That's why, that's another thing. I'm just interested to see what you're going to send me, but New York City as the measuring stick. And they've worked for the city, and they've done big projects for the city,
Right,
and
right.
they have, design standards and all those things. So that's Heather Sporn, who is going to talk in February.
Okay.
So
So I'm
my-
sure you're
my
familiar
guess
with
is that I'll see you then.
with Philadelphia's, PHS, and
Yeah,
they seem like they have their stuff together too a bit.
right. But I'd be interested to know, that carbon sequestration that you were pointing to.
Yeah, no, yeah, they did like a
Shredded-
micro
shredded
analysis,
trees.
because usually, yeah. So I'll send it to you. It's an article. I think there's a website. It's called Science Daily, and it's like all these different studies on anything, and you just can type in a search like trees, and it will come up with all the recent scientific articles for trees.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's really fun. You find some really cool
I've heard
stuff.
of Science Daily, but I didn't know I could do that.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's really
that's good.
fun. You find all kinds of fun stuff on there. It's really fun.
Okay. Well, thank you for that tip.
Thank you. I will be in touch, and thank you for staying on.
Oh, yes, walkie-talkie.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.